Sure. I'm very happy to welcome you tonight, especially those of you living in Africa. So, as you may all know, the African continent is really at the heart of the teaching and areas of reflection of Sciences Po, and through these activities, which are carried out in close collaboration with African universities, of course. Sciences Po participates in the necessary renewal of the way we look at Africa. And among the few ongoing initiatives or projects and partnerships, there's of course the MasterCard Foundation Scholars Program at Sciences Po, which is a system that allows 140 students to come to Sciences Po from 20 different countries and from disadvantaged backgrounds in sub-Saharan Africa. But among those partnerships, there's also a very strong and sophisticated partner universities program that Sciences Po has developed for, let's say, the last 15 years. It was the African continent, and we're talking about almost 20 partner universities, partnership with research centers, with private companies, with international organizations as well. And those partnerships, of course, benefit students from both continents. And of course, there's the BA program, which is the Sciences Po Europe Africa program, which was created in 2011 in Paris, and which is now delivered on the Reims campus. So this program, focusing on the ties between Europe and the African continents, offers an opening to Africa and its challenges through courses, classes on the political, economic, social, cultural dynamics of the continent. And of course, within this ecosystem, there are the Sciences Po alumni activities with the different entities of our association. Of course, the Cercle Afrique, which is based in Paris, but also the different sections we have on the continent, in Morocco, in Algeria, in Senegal, in Côte d'Ivoire, in South Africa, or in Gabon. And this is the reason why having such gathering as and conferences as we're having tonight is of course very important, because it takes place within this quite elaborated framework. And we have the great pleasure to welcome tonight Kola Aina, who's the founder and managing partner at a ventures platform fund, and who will tackle the crucial issue of tech entrepreneurship and venture capital in Africa. So Kola Aina, welcome to Sciences Po, and thank you for being with us tonight. Kola Aina will be introduced by Babacar Seck, our friend who's the president of the Cercle Afrique of Sciences Po alumni, who's also a private equity and venture capital investor at Proparco. So, dear Babacar, thank you very much for having made this conference possible tonight. And now the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Bernard, for the introduction. I think it's really great that we're able to gather together today on this annual Africa reunion of the Sciences Po Alumni Association on the eve of the Africa Day, which is celebrated globally tomorrow. we're really honored to have with us Kola Aina to talk today about tech entrepreneurship and venture capital in Africa. So I think in a nutshell, Kola needs no introduction, but I will still introduce him nevertheless. He's one of the most experienced startup investors on the continent. He has invested in over 60 companies over the past 10 years. After being himself an entrepreneur in Nigeria. And Kola has been a key player over the past decade in supporting the emergence of the Nigerian and African startup scene. He has been alongside with and through his firm Ventures platform, an early backer of some of the big success stories on the African continent, such as Paystack, a fintech startup founded in 2016 that was acquired by Stripe for $200 million in 2020, and a number of other companies that are having a tremendous impact on the continent. And I'm thinking here about agriculture technology, health technology, education technology, many sectors in which there are big problems that require innovative solutions. And so today we will have the chance to discuss this with Kola himself. And I think it will also be an opportunity to also shed light on the very positive things that are happening in Africa today. I know that when you look at the news in the West in general, you have the impression that African countries, Nigeria or other markets are mostly about poverty, are mostly about war or coup d'etat. I think today we want to show also and highlight some of the other areas where Africa is really innovating on a global level. And so I would like to now yield the floor to Kola Aina. So Kola, the floor is yours now. The way this conversation is going to be structured is that Kola will first give us an overview on the topic that we have chosen today. Then I will ask him a few questions, and then you will all have the opportunity to converse with him and share your questions as well. Over to you, Kola.
Oops, yep. Thank you, Babacar, for the very generous and kind introduction. You make me sound better and look better than I am. I'm delighted and honored to be here to have a conversation with this very important organization. I've been asked to speak on the topic of tech entrepreneurship and venture capital in Africa. And when I got the topic, I thought we can talk about this for a whole day or a whole week. So I've decided to sort of narrow my 10 to 15 minute conversation on giving you a very quick run through of the evolution of our ecosystem, where we are today and what I anticipate that we'll see in the future, and then leave it open for questions. I hope you find that useful. So in the beginning, there was very little activity. When I moved to Nigeria in 2009, I tried to raise venture capital for my own business, and it was impossible, right? As a young person that wanted to build a technology company, I simply couldn't find anyone that would invest in my company. But it wasn't like nothing was happening, right? In the 2000s, you had in Kenya, you had the launch of Safaricom, launching M-Pesa, which some of you might know. In 2010 in Nigeria, and in Kenya, you had the launch of two hubs, one called CC Hub in Lagos and another called iHub in Nairobi. And both hubs have been really instrumental to laying the foundation. In 2012, we saw the first African startup get accepted into Y Combinator. And it will become obvious why I reference this. But there wasn't really much by the way of actual early stage investing at the time. A lot of it was, you see lots of hackathons, incubation programs, and it was mostly enterprise activity. I must pay homage to some of the early companies. We had lots of enterprise companies that were doing great work. You had the likes of at Level Capital in Nigeria that invested in companies like Paga, companies like InterSwitch, a Nigerian fintech that recently raised money from Leapfrog Ventures. But there was very little activity on the African continent. And then there was liftoff, you know, and I like this image of a rocket ship because that seems to be what is happening now. And things really started to turn around 2014. At that time, a company called Andela was launched. And I find Andela to be really important because Andela essentially showcased to the world that African engineering talent is probably at par with any talent in the world. I like the fact that Babacar referenced that Africa is often synonymous with war and deprivation. But the reality is that African engineering talent today, thankfully, being showcased by Andela, has now been recognized by some of the best around the world. And then in 2015, something that I consider to probably be one of the most catalytic things to have happened in our ecosystem, a company called Paystack got accepted into Y Combinator. Y Combinator is the global accelerator in San Francisco. And I think this is really catalytic because not only did Paystack get accepted into Y Combinator, the founders of this company looked backwards. They ensured that more companies got into YC. In fact, in 2016, in conjunction with the founder of Paystack, we hosted a bunch of investors from Silicon Valley in Lagos. They also visited a few other countries. And this really unlocked, you know, the mainstream of American early stage venture capital for the African ecosystem. Today, you have Y Combinator accepting companies from Senegal, from Ghana, from all over the continent. But it really started from 2015 when Paystack was accepted. I'm also really proud that Paystack was one of our early portfolio companies. And you know, the story continues. And then in 2016, we had the first African IP unicorn in Jumia. Some would argue that that's not quite an African company, but it's a company that was founded to operate in Africa, across the African continent. In 2016, our fund announced something standard check size at the time, $20,000 for 10% equity. And this was considered revolutionary at the time. I mean, if you offer these terms today, you'll be chased out of the Zoom meeting. But at the time we announced this, it was like, oh, wow, this is the best deal in town. And what that did is it really standardized transparency and sort of a pre-seed valuation. And then from then on, things just continued to roll. Mark Zuckerberg famously invested in Andela and came to visit Africa for the first time. And that really sent a really strong signal because after that, you had Jeff Bezos investing in Chipper Cash. You had several other global leading investors invest on the continent. And then in 2020, we had what can arguably be described as first full exit liquidity events. Essentially, when Paystack got acquired by Stripe for 200 million. Okay, this is what happens when you have WhatsApp on your devices. I'm gonna turn it off now. Thank you. All right, great. We live in such a connected world. And then in 2020, you had the exit of Paystack when it got acquired by Stripe. And this really was such a timely moment. I remember when this exit was going to happen, you know, you had the pandemic. In Nigeria, you had riots. There was so much going on. But the moment this got announced, it really sent a strong signal that it was possible to actually have full strategic exits on the continent. You had other exits before this, but this was the first public exit by a blue chip acquirer on the continent. In 2020, 2021, obviously, we saw the first Francophone Africa unicorn in Wave, an incredible company. And so, you know, you can see how that transition has really accelerated over the last two decades. on the continent, and it's really incredible to see. Now what
it's a bit early for questions, but I think it would be useful maybe for everyone that you explain what is a unicorn,
great.
Just what Stripe and Wave do, so that people understand how big Stripe is.
Yeah, so a unicorn is essentially a company that is valued at over $1 billion American US dollars. And Stripe today is probably one of the biggest of them. I mean, the markets have been going a little crazy, but this company is valued in excess of $50 billion, right, today. And so these are significant companies. And this company essentially acquired Paystack, a Nigerian company, as opposed to trying to expand to the region. So in other words, Paystack is essentially Stripe for Africa. And Babacar, since you raised this point, I'd like to tell a little story. I remember when I first met Shola, part of his pitch for Paystack was Stripe for Africa. So it happens that about 5 years later, or 5 years later, really, Stripe now acquires Paystack. Obviously, Wave is an incredible fintech platform that's really has been able to lower fees for financial transactions in the Francophone region, remittance, peer-to-peer, and just doing incredible work in that region. So these are massive, massive companies valued at over $1 billion, built by local teams, which is testament to the talent that is available on the continent. Thanks, Babacar. And so what does that look like in practical terms? In practical terms, when we launched our acceleration program in 2016, right around here, right? We struggled to find 10 companies to invest in. And that's not too hard to understand, right? Because in 2016, you literally only had about 150 funded companies on the continent. Incredible to believe. That number has accelerated 5x, over a period of about five years. And so you can see that it's a massive sort of growth in sort of not only investing activity, but also entrepreneurial activity. And I always like to tell the story that in 2016, we literally had, I believe we had, $150,000 to invest. No, actually, we're going to do $200,000 to invest in 10 companies. We couldn't find 5 great companies. Today, we're overwhelmed with high quality companies. And so there's something happening in the region. The quality is significantly better, but also there's thankfully now better supplies of capital as well. Likewise, the volume of capital itself has also sort of grown significantly. I mean, we're seeing total equity funding within that same period essentially grow by about 19x between 2015 and 2021. In 2015, just about $270 million was invested in companies on the continent. In 2021, about $5 billion. And so you can see that it's not a geometric increase in terms of the volume, because what you're seeing is that, so if you juxtapose the number of companies against the size of investment, what you're seeing is that companies are actually scaling, right? So it's not just a bunch of small companies that are raising money and dying very quickly. That's happening, but you're actually seeing growth year on year. Now, I have to give credit to the likes of Partech, Brighter Bridges, because just as the startup ecosystem and the VC ecosystem has grown, we also now have a thriving industry of data. When we started in 2016, Babacar, I'm sure you know, you couldn't find any data on the industry. But today, they're competing providers of data on the industry as well. So it's a true story of growth from every perspective. Now, the one that most people find really interesting, remember I talked about one unicorn in 2016, $1 billion company that listed on the exchanges in New York. Today, we have several more. In 2019, we had InterSwitch. In Egypt, you had Fowry. So there is activity all over the region, Northern Africa, Western Africa, Francophone Africa. In Nigeria, you have Flutterwave, Opay, Andela. You've got, Wave in Francophone Africa and Chippercash. And I know of a number of other companies that I would consider to be at over $1 billion in valuation that are not listed here. Again, there's always debates about valuation, but that's not unique to the African continent. At least I can count probably 3 or 4 other companies that I will consider unicorns that are not listed here. And so it's been an incredible story of growth over the last 10 years that I've been in this ecosystem, and I feel really fortunate to be a part of the market. Now, what does that look like in terms of Africa-focused funds? Now, this growth hasn't been only about foreign capital. Now, in 2018, I gave a speech called "Who Will Own Our Future Unicorns?" because I was really getting concerned that a lot of the capital was all foreign capital. But we're also starting to see growth in local funds, in indigenous funds on the continent, or in funds that are dedicated for the African region. In 2019, there's about $2.8 billion that was really Africa focused. In 2019, we had about 29 Africa focused funds launch. When we launched in 2016, the same year, we saw about 4 other micro VC funds launch in Nigeria alone. And so there is increasing local activity, which I think is really important, even when foreign investors look at the market. And so from a company formation standpoint, from a supply of capital standpoint, from a quality of company standpoint, there has been growth year on year. And I love this chart of what the ecosystem looks like. The ecosystem is growing not only in terms of companies, but also in terms of corporate VCs, in terms of media representation. You've got several providers of data. You've got, like I mentioned, exits. We're seeing the corporates participate. And I like this little chart that has a listing of people in the ecosystem. That sort of gives you perspective as to what ecosystem. We need more women on that chart, by the way, I think.
Yes.
And we need more. We also need to see more representation of academia. The academic sector has not quite stepped up. Research, as well as government, I think, are probably the missing pieces when you think about the pillars of an ecosystem. Now, so what are the major trends to summarize that growth? I think one, what we're starting to see is a trend where you're starting to see repeat founders, right? Founders who have built a company before and have either failed and are building a new company, or have sold their company and are starting a new company. And that's a real sign of growth, right? In an ecosystem. We're really starting to see that now. And that for me is really exciting to see. Oops, sorry. Yeah, we're also seeing a concept called talent recycling, where employees in companies are gaining enough confidence to step out and go start their own companies. And for us at Ventures platform, that's actually one of the key sources of our deal flow. I mentioned earlier that we're starting to see a growing number of local VC funds that serve the different regions. But also in the last year, we've seen lots of tourist capital, essentially people that would come. I hear of one fund that basically sends a term sheet and gives you 2 days to decide or deals off. And they typically send the term sheet on Fridays. And then, you're also seeing governance gaps that are starting to become obvious. Where companies don't have boards or don't have the right policy in place, that's starting to become obvious. And I don't think that's unique to our ecosystem. It's what you see as ecosystems grow. We're seeing what I like to call regulatory activism, which is essentially regulators becoming really active and really, because as the ecosystem grows in size and significance, then the government start to care. And then the quality of companies is improving. And obviously over the last 2 years, thanks to tourist capital, thanks to everything that we've seen in public markets, we've seen a more rapid than usual rise in valuations. But thankfully, that seems to be cooling off now. We'll talk about that in a bit. So what are the drivers of growth? I would like to identify about 5 pillars. I think the first driver of growth for me is the fact that, like I mentioned, likes of CC Hub and iHub, we over the last 2 decades, we saw the proliferation of innovation hubs and other ecosystem enablers. You know, so whether they be corporate accelerators, whether they be consulting shops, but Africa also has a really unique mix of a growing urban and mobile population that essentially are very eager to consume digital solutions, whether they be gaming solutions, digital health solutions, lending solutions. That's really Africa's superpower that needs to be leveraged. But also I mentioned African startups getting into accelerators like Y Combinator. They've played a critical role in educating global investors about what's happening in Africa. I think the exits and the unicorn valuations have also helped as a signal for success to attract more capital. And also we have to appreciate the DFIs who've played a critical role in catalyzing capital for local VCs. Folks like Babacar, Propaco, and the other DFIs have played an incredible role in supporting the local ecosystem as well. We've made a lot of progress, but it is still just day one. I think we've really just started. And so what's next? You know, I think that we would begin to see a better deal for female founders. And I think that that's because people are doing the work. I know of a number of female-led funds, gender lens type funds, and also initiatives to ensure that more funding goes to female founders. But I also think because the market is sort of changing, there's a tendency to want to, I mean, there's a stereotype that women are better managers in crisis. And so I think you will see a lot more capital flow in that direction in this climate. At least I know where we've always been keen on funding female-funded companies, but I think this is a moment. I think we're going to see a recalibration of valuations, because valuations in Africa were starting to, especially in places like Nigeria, were starting to get really close to US valuations. But I think you will start to see that recalibrate over the next, and we're already seeing that, especially given sort of where the global markets are and everything that we're seeing. We're starting to see a flight to safety. So investors becoming more risk averse and wanting to focus on companies with solid unit economics. And I think this, in a nutshell, will create new champions, right? I'm excited about the companies that would emerge over the next 2 years out of this sort of slowdown. I think you would also see local funds, local players play a bigger role, because over the last 2 years, we saw lots of foreign capital, essentially people that have never been to the continent just invest in companies. I think that's going to become harder as people want to do more diligence, want to scrutinize companies more. And that creates an opportunity for local funds who can sort of help with de-risking and help with diligence. I foresee lots of M&A activity over the next few months. We're currently exploring a couple, and I think that comes with the times that we're in. I think you're going to see that in fintech, B2B commerce, and a few other verticals. And I think this is largely going to be driven by necessity, as opposed to a company shutting down. It might make sense to sort of be acquired, but also some of these will be strategic. And then I think and I hope that we'll start to see fintech being dislodged by other verticals. I'm rooting for health tech and ed tech. But I think fintech is starting to have its day. There's still lots of work to do, but I hope we start to see that sort of slow down in all the capital going to fintech. Now, I'm just wrapping up here now. I wanted to sort of touch on where we are today. Already in 2020, just in the first quarter, we've seen $2.25 billion invested in African startups. That's over 250% year-on-year growth for the same period last year. And remember the chart where I talked about 150 deals done in 2021? Already, we've only, in the Q1, we've done 170 deals already across the continent. And so, you know, the question that you have to ask yourself is, is the African ecosystem anti-fragile? Or is this just a lagging indicator? And I'd love to get responses from the audience when we get to the Q&A. I don't know, to be honest. I think there's some anti-fragility there. I think that the companies here tend to be solving real problems, and I think that there's always been an Africa discount. But you know, I think there is cause for caution. I say this because if you look at the data for the same period in 2021, we're up 2.5x, despite the fact that we started to see the market cool off from February, right? And so, you know, you have to wonder if there's an anti-fragility going on there, or if this is just a lagging indicator. Again, I wasn't going to have all the answers. I was going to leave you with some questions. And so what are the opportunities for the future? One, I think there's significant non-consumption on the continent. And so there's still lots of opportunities to solve problems. I think the population and the fact that the first layer of the digital economy has been built, payment has largely been solved. Some would say not completely solved, but you can provide a digital service, whether it's education or healthcare, and get value. And so that presents an opportunity to solve other problems in healthcare and education, in governance. And so for me, I'm excited about this next wave of innovations that we can start to see on the continent, built by entrepreneurs and invested in by investors. I think there's opportunities for folks in the diaspora, folks across the world that want to work with African companies, because African companies are now starting to need lots of talent, whether it be engineering talent or operational talent. And finally, I think local funds, local investors have a critical role to play and have an opportunity to sort of guide global capital, especially in markets that are as difficult as we're in today. I wanted to end with just talking about Ventures Platform, our fund. We're an early stage discovery fund for Africa. We invest across the continent. We are a thesis-driven fund. We believe that non-consumption is perhaps the best kept secret in the world. And so we're looking to invest in companies that are solving for non-consumption, because we believe that these market-creating innovations are the most sustainable way to create prosperity on the continent. And so we support the entrepreneurs building these innovations. To date, we've backed a bunch of category-leading companies. Again, companies like Paystack, companies like Mono, Number, MDAS, across different verticals, from healthcare to fintech to edtech to agri-tech, companies like Thrive Agric. And we tend to be early investors in some of the leading companies across the continent. So far, we've invested in over 70 companies. Babacar's data was kind of old, across 6 countries on the continent. And our companies have raised an excess of $800 million post our investment. So we also tend to play a catalytic role. Thank you for listening. I hope you have a fair idea of the evolution of the ecosystem. I'll be happy to take questions now. Thanks.
Thank you, Kola, for the presentation. I will kickstart the questions with the following one, and allow me to be the advocate of the devil. Isn't this venture capital thing in Africa just a bubble? With a lot of money being very opportunistic, investing in a very short term to make quick money. And, you know, Africa probably has bigger problems to solve with the 5 billion that were invested last year. What would you say to that?
Great question. Look, I think that, I'll start from the last question. I think that Africa's best opportunity is not to try to attain development the way some of the Western countries have. I think Africa's best chance is to leapfrog, right? We have to go about it a different way. And so this is why when you think about development in Africa, I'm not saying you ignore building roads and you know, traditional infrastructure. I think you have to think about it very differently. Africa today has a very youthful population. When you think about the mix of the population as well, the population is it needs opportunity, access, education, you know, it's a vibrant population. And so you've got to invest in the kinds of innovations that meet the bulk of that population where they are. And these goods tend to be digital. It tends to be access. It tends to be the ability to transact. And so I don't think that, I think the monies that have been invested have been well delivered. I also think that on the balance of scale, a lot of the capital, if we establish that a lot of the capital has gone to fintech, then I think that's the right place to start, because you have to allow people transact and exchange value for economies to grow. And that's what fintech does. It accelerates the transfer of value. It also allows government to be able to tax. It allows government to be able to have visibility, and it gives access. And so I think that this is capital well directed. Finally, I'm not a short-term investor, and I'm an investor in Africa. You know, when we started investing in 2014, we didn't have any idea where the exits will come from. So I think you have lots of people that are vested in the continent. I mean, I mentioned that there's tourist capital, there's folks that we know are not going to stick around, but there's lots of folks that are committed. And thankfully we have partners like DFIs who are committed for the long term. So I believe this is real.
Thank you, Kola. And no doubt, I also think the same. But I think it's important to ask those difficult questions, because not everyone is following the sector as closely as you are. Maybe a follow-up question to that. Could you give us maybe one example of a company that really impressed you in the way that they're transforming a sector that's impacting the lives of Africans?
Wow. I'll give two examples. And I'll be selfish and give them from our portfolio. Actually, I'll give one from the portfolio and one not from the portfolio. Not from the portfolio is a company that's called Weller Health. This company basically they started with trying to essentially provide access to malaria medicine, right? Quality malaria medicine, but they since pivoted to basically democratizing access to health insurance. Now, if you know anything about Africa, you know that a large chunk of the population are informal workers. And so they basically live on what they earn on a daily basis. So you can imagine someone maybe earns $5 a day or $4 a day. What Weller Health does is Weller Health enables this person pay 10 cents or 10 euro a day, 10 cents to access health insurance coverage. And you can pay that on a daily basis, either through USSD or through their airtime. Now, what that does is transformative, because one of the biggest sources of poverty on the continent is healthcare, right? People are essentially one medical disaster from bankruptcy. And so that's a startup that is transforming lives, in my view. I'll give another example. You have a company like Paystack, and I want to give a fintech one because people often think fintech don't affect development. I have spoken to tens of people who were jobless, and the only opportunity they had to build a business was because they could now sell art or fashion items they made to someone in Lomé, right? And that person could pay online, and then they could ship it through a transport bus to that person. And so what these fintechs do is essentially they create the layer for a new economy. Before Paystack, you couldn't collect payments online in Nigeria. You just couldn't. Today, over 150,000 merchants can trade online because of Paystack. That's transformative, because you then need to look at the number of jobs those merchants create, the contribution to GDP, and the taxes they pay. And so it's not all vanity metrics, it's not all valuation. These companies are transforming lives in real ways. Thanks.
Thank you, Kola. I will ask one question because this is an alumni gathering. So as you can see also in the room, we have a number of people from across the globe. We have also alumni that are based in Africa or outside Africa who are interested in this sector. And you mentioned something interesting in your conclusions, that there is an increasing need for talent driven by the development of this space. Can you tell us about the needs that you see, the kind of skills that are required, and what should someone have in mind if tomorrow they want to join a growing startup in Africa?
That's a great question. In the early days, it was all about engineering talents. That's all people wanted. Developers. But now it's about operations. It's about finance. People are looking for CFOs. People are looking for financial controllers. People are looking for COOs. People are looking for head of compliance folks, right? Because what you're seeing is, as this company scale, the young founder experience becomes limited, right? And so the challenges start to happen. And so I think for those of you in the audience that may be interested in joining a startup, by the way, these startups can now afford to pay well. A number of them are competitive with global compensation packages as well. And a number of them have great cultures to work with. Paystack probably has one of the most vibrant cultures out there. And there are several other companies that can be examples. I think, look, you want to watch for culture. You want to ensure you select a company that has a great culture. There are cases where companies don't have good policies or good cultures. You also want to ensure that it's a company that's well-funded, so such that there's sufficient runway. You want to ensure that it's a company that has great unit economics, such that even if the funding dries up, the business model itself is sustainable. And I would question sort of the vision of the founders as well. But yeah, there's needs across the board, mostly operational needs.
Thank you, Kola. And I will ask a last question before passing on, opening the floor. In practical terms, how do you do that? There's so many startups in Africa. How do you go about to approach them? What would you advise?
Yeah, so one thing I'll advise is we're launching on our site, Work with a Startup, on the Ventures Platform website, actually probably in about 3 weeks. A section of our website where you can apply to work with startups in our portfolio. I'll say look out for that. I'll put the URL in the link. But a number of the startups also have their vacancies on their website. Practically speaking, I would subscribe to TechCrunch or follow TechCrunch on Twitter, because every time a company raises money, they're going to be hiring. And that's always a good signal that the company can, because most companies actually raise money so they can hire. So a fundraiser announcement is a great signal. And there are some platforms like Move Me Back Africa, I believe it's called Move Me Back Africa, that sort of help folks that want to work with African startups. There's an organization, if you're an operator, there's an organization I would totally recommend called Black Ops. I would share URL. It's an organization for people in operations, and they often are really great at providing access to opportunities. I hope that helps.
Thank you, Kola. I think that is very helpful. So now we will open the floor. So if you have a question, can you please raise your hand through the Zoom platform, and Camila will pass you the microphone, the virtual microphone.
Stéphane Boko, the floor is yours.
Yeah, hi everyone, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, well, Kola, first I wanted to thank you for your presentation. I was curious to know if you would share the slides, because those were very informative. Just as a way of quick, very brief introduction, my name is Stéphane Boko. I run a private equity fund focused on African late stage companies called 101 Capital. So we are in fund formation. I won't say much more about that, but being focused on late stage companies, I was curious to hear your thoughts on liquidity events. And you've mentioned that what you foresee in the near future are, M&A opportunities. I was just curious to hear on the other side, in terms of IPOs on the African markets, how do you see this really happening? Do you see more IPOs coming up? And a question I have is really specifically how can we make the stock markets, local stock markets, more appealing to technology companies on the continent? From your experience also working with the regulatory bodies in Nigeria, I would just be curious to hear your thoughts on that, because I think for me that's very critical. M&A is one thing, being acquired is great, but raising capital through listing on the stock markets could also be a great way. And the second question, which is kind of follow-up question as well, I had was, from your perspective, what is the recipe for an African company to really become a global champion? Because I think it's great to have companies expanding as startups, locally from Kenya to Uganda, Tanzania, on the other side from Nigeria, Ghana, and so on and so forth. But at some point, what we see from the deal flow we have is, some of the founders tell us that they hit a certain glass ceiling. I think it will be actually interesting to see African companies acquiring Asian companies, acquiring European companies, really becoming global champions. And I'm just curious to hear, from your perspective, what would be the recipe for that? Those are the only two questions I will share here, but I've shared a few more in the chat. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I think, look, the last question is one that's already happening. We're invested in Migo, that's in Brazil. You've got African companies acquiring companies in sort of the UAE. Flutterwave recently announced a head of growth in the US. I don't know how that's going yet. So look, I think growth is in phases, right? I think at some point people said African companies were not growing beyond one country. Now they are. Now I think the next phase is you're going to start to see companies conquer regions and then become Pan-African, or in some cases maybe just be regional and go to other countries. I think it's going to happen. It's a function of growth and time, and I think it's a natural transition. I also think that as the quality of these companies continues to improve, then they can truly become global companies and global champions, right? And so we no longer are looking at African companies. We're looking at startups, period. Startups that happen to operate in Africa and that can be globally competitive. We are also starting to see a new wave of enterprise SaaS companies that from day one are targeting global markets. We actually have about 3. We have a company in our portfolio actually called Ibanku that has customers in the Caribbean, the US, India. So it's actually already happening, right? But I think you're going to continue to see that scale. The second point is, I can't go into too much detail, but I know there's a lot of work to see companies IPO locally and raise money from local stock markets. I advise the Nigerian Stock Exchange informally, and I'm in talks with them. And I know that that's work that's ongoing. But there's lots of capacity that has to be built locally to make that happen. I know that there's work going on in South Africa as well to do some of that. So I think you will see that in the coming years. I mean, I think the local markets also don't want to miss out of all the action that seems to be happening. I think the focus just has to be on building truly valuable companies, right? Because once you start going to public markets, as we see in the US, you know, the fundamentals have to be solid, right? And so I hope to see more of that soon. Thanks.
Thank you, Kola. I think we have a question from Charles Abedier and another question from Abiodun Odunuga.
Yes, thanks, Babacar. Good evening, all. I'm Charles Abedier, and I was alumni at Sciences Po a couple of years ago. My question to you
Charles,
would be...
if you could introduce also what you currently do, please.
Oh, okay, all right. I'm a senior investment officer at the African Development Bank. Okay, so my question was in two parts, right? The first one would be on the origination side, deal sourcing, etc. What will make companies stand out from your point of view? You indicated they are early stage investors, so essentially you will not necessarily look at the financial of the company, but I guess there is some triggers that you need to look at. I don't know if it's mainly related to the sector, to the prospect, etc. How do we make that analysis? Yeah. And the following question, also related to that, since you started investing in 2014, could you give us an indication of the rejection rate or percentage of company that succeeded versus your total investment? And the last one would be in terms of exit strategy. How what makes you exist in a company, up to which point you decide to do so, particularly given that we don't necessarily have in-depth liquidity market or stock exchange that can take up this company forward. So, but you mentioned the point that you look at a company that would be valuable on the long term, but at which point of time do you decide to exit?
Yeah, lots of questions.
Thank
you. I guess some of what you've asked is proprietary, so I can respond to some of it in some level of detail, but I'm happy to take the rest offline. We have done whole exits and partial exits in our portfolio, and so we have a strategy where we look to take some liquidity at a certain point. So we're not necessarily waiting for IPOs in every case. I'll park it there. And I'm happy to take it offline. I'll share my email in the chat. In terms of what we look for, we are not an idea stage investor. We don't invest in ideas. We invest in companies that have built a minimum viable product, have some early traction. The traction doesn't have to be revenue, but we want to see some traction. We're happy to be the first check in the company. But we also want to ensure that it's a large and growing market. We want to ensure that it's a painkiller. In other words, it's critical. People need it. It's not a nice to have. We also want to ensure that it falls in our thesis. We're thesis driven and thesis guided. And I think I shared a little bit about our thesis. But finally, we spend an incredible amount of time trying to get into the minds of the founders and sort of understand who they are and how they think. Because we're ultimately investing in people at the stage at which we invest. We do some analysis, where there's data, where there's traction, we look at it. We also look at the unit economics and the sort of business model. But I would say about 60% of our decision criteria is based on the quality of the founding team. I believe the last question you asked about decisioning criteria, how exits. There was one more question that I've missed now.
Yeah, the other question was like type of rejection rate that you have. You look at the landscape of,
Yeah, we have invested in, we see a lot of deal flow. Babacar knows this, he's seen our CRM. We invest in less than 1% of the companies that we look at. And we've done 70 deals. So that gives you sort of an idea of what we've seen over the years. Success rates, we have a casualty rate that's less than 20% today.
All right, that's great. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charles, for your question, and Kola for the answer. Abiodun?
All right. Yeah, thank you, Babacar. Hello, Kola. I know this is Biodun Noga, your Nigerian brother based in Paris.
Hi, Biodun.
Yeah, reconnecting with. Thank you for the insightful presentation. I consult for French startups and European startups working in the African continent, so mostly Nigeria. So I do the other side of the bridge. So I'm interested in, and I'm curious to know about how you see after the African trade, agreement playing a role in all of this, if there is a role actually it's playing to, spur engagement in the ecosystem. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we actually have a slide on AFCTA in our deck because we think it holds a lot of promise for the continent. Stefan that talked about going global. I think if African companies can just go Pan-African, that'll be great for a start. Because Africa is huge. I don't know if you've seen these pictures where people place the African landmass against the rest of the continents. Africa is massive. So if a company can truly become Pan-African, I think that's enough for me. I don't know about you guys. And I think AFCTA has the power to unlock that, right? In so many ways. And I'm happy to say that we've been involved in some conversations around sort of what does AFCTA look like for startups, right? And how might startups sort of benefit from that, both in terms of the movement of talent and goods, and services, right? And so it's been a little bit slower than I would have hoped, but I believe that AFCTA would unlock a lot of potential that's now currently not being tapped. Thanks. By the way, the AFCTA is the Africa Free Trade. Essentially, think about it like an economic zone for the continent in some ways to ease the movement of goods, services, and commerce. Thanks. Stefan, I agree with you to infinity and beyond.
Do we have other questions in the room? Oh, I see that Sohna has a question. Please.
Yes, hi all, and thank you for the presentation. I had a quick sorry, let me introduce myself. So I work I'm a private debt analyst in Paris, working on French investments and looking to work in African investments and in the African ecosystem. My question had to do with when I see a lot of the news about African startups, I feel like it's always mostly the same countries. And I was wondering, how do you see the future for countries, let's say like Gabon? I've never seen anything about Gabon. Do you think countries like that will be left out? Do you think they will benefit from the champions of other countries that are like, let's say, Kenya or Cote d'Ivoire? How do you see it going for them? Or do you think they will catch up in the future?
Yeah, that's a great question. Look, and I think it's getting better. I think the reason Nigeria, Egypt, Kenya are leading the charts is quite obvious. If you draw the charts from a population standpoint, you start to answer the question, right? So companies want to sort of launch and grow in large markets, just because when you raise venture, you have to return venture. You have to make venture returns, And so it's really about market size. Gabon's population is, I believe, last time I checked, less than 4 million or so. And so it's a small market, right? And so it's tough to justify venture returns. But what we're starting to see is companies started in companies like Zambia. We recently invested in a Zambian company, and that company is serving customers across Africa. And so I think it takes a kind of company to really be founded in a smaller sort of country and scale Pan-African. So I think you see more of that. I think the smaller countries also have an advantage that has to be leveraged. We're also seeing the emergence of syndicate groups, angel groups in the smaller countries as well. And so I think you start to see more of that. Zambia is actually now becoming a hot spot as well.
Thank you, Kola. Actually, I might have a follow-up question on this one. How do you, I mean, you mentioned the VC model, okay? Can you tell us what is the VC model? You know, how is VC funding radically different from funding any other kind of project? Why is it so important that you have a big market?
Yeah, great question. Because I think it's at the heart of what a lot of people don't understand. I've made lots of enemies because people just assume that since I run a fund, I should be able to invest in anything that has two legs and walks. But VC essentially is an asset class that investors expect to have high risk, but also have very high return, right? And because you have a power law in VC, you essentially take it expect that, you know, a large population of a large percentage of your portfolio is going to fail, right? And so for the portions that succeed, you need to have outsized returns to make for the portion that fails. And so when I look at any company, I'm asking myself, can this company return my fund? One company, right? And so that places a lot of a really narrow filter on how you access companies. So if my fund is $50 million, for instance, or euros, for instance, I'm looking at a company today that's maybe worth, I don't know, 500,000. And I'm trying to make a judgment call that could my stake in this company be worth the size of my fund in 7 years? And so that quickly starts to disqualify lots of great companies with great people that can't necessarily return venture returns. And so if you take a step back and look at the asset mix, you recognize that there are other asset classes that you essentially want every deal you do to succeed, right? I mean, I want every deal I do to succeed, but I accept that every deal I do would not be successful. And so I want every deal I do to be able to return my fund. Babacar, are you happy with that?
Yes, thank you, Kola. We will take the last two questions. So if you have a question, please raise your hand or send a message in the chat so that we can pass you the microphone. See, we have two people who already asked questions. Maybe we'll pass to people who haven't asked questions yet. So there's Taufik.
Yeah. Hello, hi everyone. Many thanks for this very informative presentation. So a question for you, Kola.
Excuse me, Taufik, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm a Po Alumni. I represent the French-Tunisian circle, and I currently work in Paris in strategy consulting. So yeah, that's about it. And yeah, so many thanks for the informative talk. Maybe an open question, but if you were on the other side, so on the entrepreneur side, what would be the main opportunities or ideas that you would tackle to create a startup now? So I think you mentioned the fact that there is a predominant focus on fintech and that you would like to see other sectors. So I was curious to know what would be your main ideas on that.
That's a great one, and I don't want you to tempt me because I've been an entrepreneur before, and there's many people that would fire me if I went to start a company today. I built a pretty successful company in the edtech space, but I still think there's a significant opportunity in edtech. Nigeria has about 15 million out-of-school kids. The quality of education isn't great. You see that in other African countries. There's a significant opportunity to use technology to improve learning outcomes, access to education. I also think healthcare is significant. There's still malaria in several African countries. We need to solve that. Access to primary healthcare. Technology can help with some of that. We can leverage our huge diaspora. And I think even fintech, I talked about fintech. I think there's still significant opportunities in intra-Africa remittance. It's really hard to move money in Africa. And so those are some opportunities I would look at if I was starting a company today.
Thank you, Taufik, for that question. That's a very interesting one indeed. So now I would like to ask you, maybe I will, since we don't have much time, actually, we're 10 minutes past due. I will ask you, Kola, to think about maybe a concluding statement, after which I will make a short summary of our conversation before we wrap up. And since you have shared a number of links and also your email in the chat, people will be able to reach out for any follow-up conversations. So please, Kola.
Yeah, look, I think this has been an exciting conversation. Thank you for having me. Look, I think that there are incredible opportunities for those of you who are African diasporans to participate either as angel investors, as advisors, as employees in these companies. I know several companies that are hiring. So if you're looking to work in a startup, please reach out to me. If you're looking to work in a fund, please reach out to me. We're hiring as well. But look, it's an exciting time. I think that the African ecosystem is solid and healthy. You probably have read about some issues with some startups. Let's not stereotype. Issues exist everywhere. I'm excited about what the future holds, and I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kola. I will be very brief in this summary, but I think that today we have had the opportunity to discuss the history of the startup scene, and we can definitely all agree that this is still day one, but nevertheless, a lot of kilometers have been made. A lot of progress has been made over the past 5 to 10 years since you started to launch your own company and no one wanted to invest in it, to today, where we see that there are hundreds of companies each year that are raising more than $1 million, because that's one thing that was on your slide. Those 600, those are only the companies reaching a significant amount. There are many more companies that are raising smaller amounts, and you have met thousands of them. I think it is really important to highlight this, and people very often have a negative image about Nigeria, about other places on the continent. Nigeria has the most vibrant startup scene on the continent. I want to highlight this. Every time I go to Lagos, I meet entrepreneurs that are just impressive, not just because of the business they're building, but because of the people who they are, the things that they went through, and everything that it has brought to them as people and as a collective group. And so I think you described that very, very well. And now the future is really how are we going to structure this ecosystem? Can we make sure that we include women entrepreneurs, that we give them a fair chance, and that we develop local funds that are going to be committed for the long term? And so really thank you, Kola, for sharing all these insights. I want to thank also Sciences Po Alumni for hosting us, and in particular Martin, who's vice president of the board, and Camila, of course, who's our long-term partner on all the international activities of the alumni. Thank you all for taking the time on a Tuesday evening to attend this conversation. And we look forward to seeing you very soon at the other events organized by Cercle Afrique and the alumni, and notably the gala that we're organizing on the 18th of June with Maktar Diop, the CEO of the International Finance Corporation. So we really look forward to seeing you all, and thank you all for this conversation.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, Babacar.
Very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.